Buenos, hello, buenos dias, guten tag. My name is Marion Pitters, and I'm delighted to be the facilitator for today's webinar. I'm here to introduce our expert speakers, moderate some questions from you, our audience members, and ensure that the webinars progress according to schedule so that we respect everyone's time. But first, on behalf of the McMaster University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th webinar of the series, The Arctic, a Global Health Perspective. We have participants from all over Ontario, Canada, and the globe online today, graduate students, faculty from McMaster and partner institutions, as well as representatives from the World Health Organization, the WHO, and some select invitees. Many of you are preparing to contribute your skills to Arctic global health. We welcome you all to today's compelling session. This webinar series explores diverse perspectives on Arctic global health. Despite documented health disparities between the Circumpolar North and other regions, the Arctic remains an underrepresented area in global health research. This series offers a transdisciplinary look at key global health challenges and opportunities in the Circumpolar North. A quick overview of the 10 webinars in our series can be found at the Global Health website. Today's session is Webinar 8, Roots of Northern Indigenous Peoples' Health, Connecting Autonomy, Self-Governance, and Power in the Circumpolar North. It features Dr. Nancy Doubleday from McMaster University. Time has been built in for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat tool to submit questions electronically at any time during the presentation. And note that while we might not be able to get to all of your questions, we will aim to address them afterwards on the Global Health website. This webinar series has been inaugurated by Dr. Andrea Baumann, Associate Vice President of Global Health and Director of the WHO Collaborating Center in Primary Care Nursing and Health Human Resources at McMaster University. Andrea, will you please start us off with a few words about launching this webinar series?
Thank you very much, Miriam, and welcome everyone to today's session. Hopefully you'll find it very interesting. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of our President, Dr. David Farrar, and our Vice President of Health Science, Dr. Paul O'Byrne, who have been very supportive in sponsoring this series. Today, we're going to have Jeffrey McLean, who's a graduate student in global health, introduce one of our very own, Dr. Nancy Doubleday. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Nancy Doubleday. Dr. Doubleday is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at McMaster. She holds the Hope Chair in Peace and Health and is the director of the Water Without Borders program. Her experience relating to the Arctic includes, but is not limited to, supporting international polar year research, working with the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and helping establish collaborative research with Inuit through the Northern Contaminants program. Nancy is also my thesis supervisor, and she's taught me a great deal about allyship and right relations in research. When not working, Nancy likes helping people see what is not easily glimpsed, whether as a canoe guide or a naturalist. So, Dr. Doubleday, thank you very much for being with us here today. Our facilitator, Marion, will provide a 10 and 2-minute reminder, and then we can move into a discussion with questions from the chat. So the floor is yours now, Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for those very kind words, and thank you to Dr. Andrea Baumann for initiating this endeavor. It's very valuable, commendable, and I'm sure will have lasting impact. In all respects, for all of us who participate and for all of those who are not with us today, but who have real curiosity. And so I'm going to share my screen. I think perhaps it's already being shared. Is that true? Okay, so So I want to unpack the title first. So the roots of Northern Indigenous peoples' health. Now here I'm using a very broad World Health Organization view of health, and I draw from Whitehead and Marmot and the luminaries who dissected essentially social determinants, and we further unpack those to environmental and cultural and economic determinants. They all link together. They're all part of the machinery that creates or uncreates health. My role is to perhaps share a little bit of what I've glimpsed. So I'm thinking about issues around autonomy. Now, autonomy is a precursor to self-governance. Autonomy is actually a continuous variable. It occurs within us as individuals, and Bandura and his circle of associates constitute the understanding of autonomy within a concept that Bandura identifies as self-efficacy, which functions at the level of the individual. In order to speak about self-governance coherently, we need to then ascend organizational levels. And there's a sense that we are ascending because that is part of our embedded Western tautology about hierarchy. And so there is something in that actuality which I cannot escape, no matter that I spent basically about 15 years working directly to, reporting to these issues. So under the leadership and direction of Inuit leaders who were elected by their own people. So even though I've had this deep immersion in thinking otherwise, it's almost impossible for me to transcend essentially the hegemony of the power structures that are embedded in our education and in our belief systems. So I'm going to make that attempt today. I'm going to try very, very hard to step outside my own boundaries and be a faithful, to the extent that I can, within my professional responsibilities, because I function with the Inuit in legal space as an advocate and also as a scientist. So I have areas that I do not discuss, but they inform my views. And consequently, I end up asking people to understand that oral testimony. So this is oral history, this is essentially personal accounts, this is the narrative approach to qualitative data. All of those things connect to inform an understanding of truth. And that truth, if one can step aside from one's internal resistance and listen closely, and then apply one's skills from that paradigm of science and law, one can make a case. And this is what I've done. I've taken what I've heard, I've listened closely, I've tried to understand, and then in the interests of those people who have shared this information, these stories, I have done my best to present to the establishment, the world of power and science and law, the voices and the arguments and the intersections where this knowledge, this embedded lived knowledge, contests with some of the inherent assumptions and some of the deep biases within our paradigms. Things that we're not even aware of, but are intrinsic to the development of our mechanisms. I'll say more about that at the end, hopefully in response to one of the questions. So bearing in mind that Inuit were moved forcibly off the land by officials, by the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for those of you listening from beyond our borders in Canada. They were forcibly removed from their traditional lands and resettled in artificial communities with artificial housing. Houses that were designed in the south and brought north in shipping season on big barges and reassembled in situ. And at that point, you know, between 1950, when the movement of Inuit well, okay, let me try to be accurate for those with a historical preference. So essentially the period from 1949 through to the mid-50s, people from northern Quebec in particular were resettled to the high Arctic, to Grise Fiord, and to Resolute. And those people were resettled, and this is contested, and I lived through the contestation of the facts of this case. It was brutal. That's all I can say about it. And the long and the short of it is that there is no question that the subtext to that movement was to support Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. The Inuit, therefore, have an enormous claim to respect and to understanding and to inclusion as we move forward and we create paradigms for activity in the Circumpolar North and relations with the Circumpolar North and the South. So these facts are not unique to Canada. Other peoples around the Circumpolar region, and indeed elsewhere in the world, have been physically relocated, driven out, flooded out. There's a famous case from Norway, which I will not go into, but if people are interested, you should Google Alta and Dam, D-A-M. That will bring it up. So these stories of essentially the treatment of Indigenous peoples as objects of power politics are not new, and they're certainly not unique to Canada, but they are foundational. And so from that period of time, from the, say the 50s, so this is post-World War II, this is the period which gave us the great blossoming of the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration. It gave us the United Nations ascendancy. It made us hopeful. It gave us a chance to rethink human futures. But it also brought with it a lot of these geopolitical considerations. And I'm just going to, hopefully, go full screen. And I'm now going to page down. Jeffrey, my screen is not being shared. I'm trying to share it, but I'm not seeing it.
So what you may need to do is at the top of your Cisco WebEx browser.
Yeah. It says I'm sharing the webinar, but I want to share my screen. So, and I don't see a. Oh, wait a sec. Maybe it's under that arrow.
You'll have to go to the roots of northern.
So there. Okay.
There's a couple different tabs at the top.
Yeah. No, don't do anything. Don't do anything. It's just disappeared. I just had it. It disappeared. Okay. Now, there we are. Try that one. No. Okay, guys, sorry. I think I understand what's happened. I've given it to Adam, and Adam's there. Okay, now I've got, I think, mine. Full screen. Here we go. How's that, Jeffrey?
Perfect. We can see it.
All right, great. Paging down. Okay, so we have to pare back, and I talk about roots, and I mean historical roots. So the point at which Inuit dispossession began is much, much earlier. It's not the 1950s when they were well, actually, to be factual, the last community was moved in 1970. But that period of time, that was not the beginning of this disjunction in Inuit lives. It began really with the age of exploration, and particularly with the search for the Northwest Passage. That's the point at which you have commissioned exploration expeditions taking possession. And so this actually is an image created by the ship's artist, and it is the sounding of the bay where essentially British territorial claims were being established. Now, this brings up a very large question. If one party asserts that they can move into your house and appropriate your bedroom, and there's no question about this, there is no other place for you to go to examine the fairness of this, what then? And essentially, that's a way of understanding the immediacy of what happened. So the 500 years of exploration and imperialism, and I would actually, so the 500 years is Noam Chomsky's 500 years. I would actually push that back a little bit farther. I would push it back essentially to Columbus and slightly before, and I would include the Americas, all of the Americas, in this large appropriation by Europe. And so when we start to think in these geopolitical terms, we have to begin to question a lot of things. And that includes some of the fundamental tenets, and it includes things like the Doctrine of Discovery, which essentially proposes that the circumpolar region that you will see on your screen is the gray and white map, that area was largely to be considered frontier, uninhabited, therefore open to seizure by other powers. And then this begins the Great Games. This is part of the Great Northern Game, and by that I mean the diplomacy and the counter-diplomacy and the Cold War and the rest of it. If we look at the colored image, and I like this map very much. This comes from the Queen's Jubilee Atlas. And it comes from the late 70s, 1977. And so at this point in time, the depiction of the area of polar ice is quite substantial. And of course, we all know that subsequently that's been very much reduced. And indeed, we've actually seen an ice-free circumpolar region, in terms of northern ice that's substantial. Pack ice continues to move around, but we have had open ice, open water. And so it's 2012, and I think 2005 was also pretty warm. But anyway, it goes on. So this snapshot in time is sort of historical in some senses. It's very historical in other senses because it's actually a map of polar exploration. And it's not important that you know these details. You can find this source and you can look at this map yourself. But I'll just mention that the heavy lines that you may be able to make out are voyages of exploration, discovery, and appropriation. And you can see that people in boats have been traveling all over the place, and they go around Greenland, and they certainly come into the area that I'm going to focus on a little bit with some of my stories. And they certainly make it over to Alaska, and you can see the Great Northern Sea route that goes around Russia. I mean, the stories go on and on and on. This has been happening for more than 500 years. So the long and the short of it is, before this incursion, and even during the initial incursion by Franklin and others, and certainly before Franklin, you had John Dee, making maps and telling people about the riches of the New World on the basis of Martin Frobisher's very bad geological information. And you actually had Martin Frobisher mining fool's gold because he thought it was actual gold on Baffin Island. And he did that for 3 years in a row. And the Inuit watched. Their stories, their oral histories of Inuit watching the behavior of these people and wondering what on earth they were doing. And then finally when they left and didn't return, they left all sorts of equipment behind. Lots of valuable material made of metal, because the one thing that Inuit had limited access to in their world was metal. They had a source of iron in meteors in Greenland, and those meteors were subsequently taken to New York by an American explorer, and there goes the source of the iron. But they also had native copper, and they used native copper, and they also traded a bit to get the metal. So when Frobisher left, this is a story I told at the Swiss Academy of Sciences a few years ago, and some of you may have heard it, I don't know. So the long and the short of it is that the Inuit found one object very, very interesting, and what it was a metal anvil. And this story I have to credit Robert McGee immediately, because Robert McGee is an incredible Arctic archaeologist who I think is an unsung hero of the North. He has been recognized to some degree, but he's also been reviled because of the truth of his research. So at any rate, the Inuit found the blacksmith's anvil. Now, a blacksmith's anvil taken by ship to Baffin Island, it weighed at least a couple of 100 pounds. And the Inuit could not understand what on earth these people wanted with something like this. And so they took it as an object to use for a test of strength. And they would see who could throw it the farthest. And I think that's an emblematic story that speaks to the health and well-being and the status. And now I'm talking global health. How many people in industrial environments, slave laborers, they might be strong, but they would not be as well nourished, and they would not be as healthy in all likelihood. And I doubt very much that many of Frobisher's men would have been able to throw it as far as the Inuit were throwing it. And that's an assumption on my part, but I base this on correlations with oral histories that have been shared with me in the Western Arctic, where stories of the whalers, and I come back to the stories of the whalers. This is a very important piece in the puzzle of understanding how to treat oral histories and how to deal with them on an evidentiary basis. So the tales of the strength of the hunters and the whalers using tools that they made themselves are really key in understanding the baseline for circumpolar health. And I think that's something we overlook a lot because we're just not aware of it. We have no way of knowing this, in part because we are looking at the time since the 1950s when people have been so radically transformed by systems beyond their control, not necessarily for the better in many cases, because there are communities that vote to reject alcohol. They ban alcohol sale, they ban alcohol import, but there's still bootleggers who bring it in, and then there's violence. It's inevitable almost. And when the European protests against seal hunting took place, it gutted the Inuit seal livelihood as well, and that was connected to their subsistence because hunting the seal for meat yielded the pelt, which could be used for boots and hammocks, whatever you want to call them, but could also be sold for cash and then resold by the traders in Europe to make wonderful European seal skin boots. So Maloof documented this in 3 volumes. I talk about evidence. This is a case where statistics comes into it. So now we're talking Western science. And the documented impact on communities affected by the European seal ban in 1983 on the order for a community of approximately 400, 500 people, they would have had probably $1 million in income, and it would have been reduced to practically nothing, and they would all be on welfare, and then the problems would show up in terms of violence and other indicators that we do measure and we are aware of. So that's a short version of going from probably 500 or 600 years ago into the present and understanding what the baseline might be. And along the way, we're also making a transition in our own understanding as Westerners, as people from the South, as people from other places, that while we may see the North as a frontier where we can go and prove ourselves and acquire reputation and wealth, we are actually in somebody's backyard. It is, in fact, a homeland. And I think the period of the 1950s cannot be discussed without recognizing the relationship to militarization. So the Cold War, the advent of the Cold War between what was then the USSR and the United States largely, put Canada right in the middle in geopolitical terms. If you recall the circumpolar map, the shortest distance from Moscow to Washington, D.C. is across Canada. And this is the consequence. So the geopolitical consequence for Canada is that we have had a deal with the American military to come in and to build the dew line site. And that's chain of pearls. I call this the chain of black pearls. These are dew line sites. Many have been decommissioned. Most of them have been deconstructed. Some have been preserved because they're connected with airstrips. So Hall Beach, for example, is an important landing area still. But those sites were personed by American military personnel. Sometimes there would be a Canadian caretaker. Sometimes the caretakers would be local people, but often not. So this construction was a massive disruptor to the local communities. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sam Ratty in a few minutes. And Sam Ratty, I'll just say, Sam Ratty grew up on Banks Island at Sachs Harbor, and he had a very traditional upbringing. I'm sure he would not mind me telling you about it a little bit. In the morning.
Excuse me, Nancy, 10 minutes.
Okay. So in the mornings, his father, before he gave them breakfast, would put his 3 sons outside in their bare feet, regardless of the weather. And Sachs Harbor at that time would get -70. It used to be the White Fox capital of the Arctic, and Sam and his brothers would go out and they had to run around the house. I forget how many times, but a number of times, and then they could come in and have their breakfast. And this was part of the training to be able to endure hardship. So if you think about what that means for self-efficacy, if you think about what that means for a sense of autonomy, your life is in your hands and in your body and your embodied knowledge of the conditions around you. And if you forget, you might die. So we have the geopolitical realities, very large forces operating, the disruption of massive economic injections, the injections of military personnel who did not understand and probably didn't really have a chance to understand local people. And a lot of sad things happened. So Sam Ratty, when I met Sam Ratty in 1980 in Greenland, I had gone, I'd taken a pro bono assignment, expenses only, invitation to go and to work with the COPE delegation at what would be the second meeting of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. And at that meeting, an empty seat was reserved on the dais. So this is the Inuit from Canada, Greenland, and Alaska, with an empty seat for the essentially events and Nenets from Russia. Because they were not allowed to travel, and at that time the view of the USSR was that they didn't have Indigenous peoples. So it was, and that was the Chinese position. Let me hasten to add. Also, they did not have Indigenous people, and that view was expressed to me by the ambassador to the mission in Geneva in 1985 probably. So there's a long-standing resistance to allowing even the identities of Indigenous people, never mind their rights, to be recognized. So I worked for SAM and the Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement, which was the claims body that was self-organized in the Western Arctic region because of the oil and gas incursions into the Beaufort Sea. And so that work was in the context of establishing the right of Indigenous peoples in the North who are not under treaty ever to engage with our federal government in Canada to negotiate for land and resource rights. And in the process of being a field worker in this region, I spent time in each of these communities. I documented the records of community meetings. I co-led workshops with colleagues from the communities, and we documented what it was that was priority for land claims. And in the area, certainly around Tuk, Tuktoyaktuk, Aklavik, Pawatuck to some extent, and Sachs Harbor. This area, they're very, very interested. Aklavik was the center. They're very interested in whaling. Whaling is a key issue. And it was one that was very unpopular because the Canadian government, you may or may not know, was part of the International Whaling Commission until 1983, 82, 83, when the Minister of Fisheries went to a meeting and was doused with blood by demonstrators outside who were objecting to whaling in Canadian waters. And fair enough, because whalers had come from Europe since the Basques came to Newfoundland, so 500 years ago at least. But in the 17th century, 18th century, we had whalers who were Dutch, we had whalers who were other origins. They would pass through Scotland and they would carry on to Baffin and Greenland. And we had the Americans in the Western Arctic. We had the American schooners coming up from San Francisco. So because this issue was not really well received by the Canadian government, but it was important to the people. Sam, Ratty, and I had an opportunity through the Whales Beneath the Ice program that the World Wildlife Fund was leading to do some research. And we did this together. I was the scribe, Sam was the interviewer, and we went to the communities and we essentially invited anyone who felt they had knowledge or interest in this issue to meet with us. And as a result, we were able to change the policy of the federal government, and we were able to secure a recognition of the right to whale on the part of the Inuvialuit that's part of the land claim agreement. And then, as a representative of COPE, I was seconded to the Inuit Committee on National Issues and participated in the First Ministers' conferences, and through those processes, we secured the amendment to the Canadian Constitution that recognizes and constitutionally protects the land claims agreement. Now, nothing is immutable and everything can be undone, and there are lots of ways that corruption can go around things. But these are important steps. And on the basis of those steps, we were also able to argue that the paradigm of collaborative research matters. And we took the case to SSHRC in a workshop in Banff in 1982, arguing that communities ought to be able to access SSHRC funding for research. And basically we were documented and our words were sort of indicated in the proceedings, but there was no change in SSHRC policy, SSHRC being the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so it's been a long, slow process, and I'm really happy to see how far we've come. And I'm really delighted to have colleagues like Dr. Guido Ludwigczyk who are carrying forward in such a fantastic way. So things are changing and there is hope. So the gloom and doom I've shared with you is not the end of the story. Along the way, we also changed the National Parks classification system to make it possible to have a northern national park on the North Yukon that would respect Indigenous rights and would be co-managed by Indigenous people. The division of the Northwest Territories was part of the work we did, and I can tell you later about the travesty that I lived through with the conflict between Western science and the Caribou census, and the oral knowledge of the people concerned. So quickly, because I know the time is short, I would just like to suggest that a map is a perspective, and our perspective matters very much. And Jeffrey, this slide is for you. Thinking about standpoint theory, okay? Basics. So the Inuit are very well informed about the basics. And we were on the front lines on the northern contaminants issue. I started my role as legal counsel and environmental advisor to the National Inuit Organization in 1985. And about a month after I started, the front page of the Globe and Mail broke the contaminant story, and we then fought with the feds for 2 years to get access to the data, to get access to the meetings. And finally, we're welcomed in about 2 years later, after a lot of skirmishes, we were welcomed in as parties to the Northern Contaminants Program, which has been running for more than 25 years and has been widely celebrated by the federal government as a marker of success. And there are 3 components of physical health, ecological health, and human health. And there is a vast compendium of northern health research associated with this work. So, my view, Inuit were self-reliant, incredibly strong and healthy, self-governing and autonomous. The environment was clean. They spoke their own language and observed their own customs without shame. And shame is a huge part of what we have to admit, and we have to overcome, and we have to reconcile. And so did all the other Indigenous people. So my call is, it's painful, it's hard, but to reflect on the values that have shaped our institutions and look at the way in which our institutions shape our health and the health of others, and also to call our institutions and our values to account for the contemporary ecological crises we face. There is a very powerful connection. So, a few points on respect and how to behave, and evidence of a sustainable lifestyle. This is a Thule house. It's probably 1,000 years old. It's from the Central Arctic. These people lived a sustainable lifestyle, and they left behind them only things that were natural materials, and most of which would degrade over time. Some of the work I've done with students and also the community partners are incredibly important. I'm very honored by the work that I've seen come out of the collaborations we have been privileged to hold. In particular, the International Polar Year, I was a PI on a component of a circumpolar study and co-PI on the national study. It was circumpolar tree line and the way in which it reflects climatic change. But my insistence was that we put a human face. We had to listen to the people who were there, and we had to include them. And the original proposal was for sites at Senakilawak and Cape Dorset and Kikatarjuak, Kimarut. But we got pushed into a circumpolar tree line study, and they thought I should just roll over. And I said, no, I know, because the ecotone, the reality is that the sensitivity of the Arctic to these changes is far greater. They will be seen first. They will be very visible. And so we persevered, and out of our field work, the community members found the first record of an Arctic orchid, which is part of the biodiversity indicator system that is constructed to pinpoint climate change. And so hats off to the people in Senakilawak, evidence of their acute capacity as observers and reporters of change. We just need to learn how to handle their data.
Just one more minute, Nancy.
Thank you. And this is one of the students and people from Senakilawak, Arctic willows, saxifrage, and fireweed, all part of the herbarium that we co-created and sent to the schools. The students who are now the new generation of leaders, and a word of thanks. Thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which now does fund and support community research, and to Ocean Canada, which is now drawing to a close, and we've just completed the first draft of a book, and I'm very pleased to say that we have managed in our deep science commitments to find a way to include 2 chapters on reconciliation. To McMaster University for bringing me in as the first Hope Chair in Peace and Health. My term is now at an end, so my claim is only to being the inaugural Hope Chair. And it gave me the freedom to push the boundaries, to bring the complex systems thinking from science into humanities. And the next steps are really to address the values and the history of ideas. So I did a bit of this in a Denver Law Journal article in the 80s. I will be doing a bit more of it because this is the foundation of a lot of things we hold as true, which are actually probably more matters of opinion. So I'm deeply indebted to the team, to the colleagues, to the students, to the communities, and to Sam Ratty, and to Agnes Semler, and to all the old ones who provided so much guidance at a critical stage of my life and helped me to see. And I hope I help others to see as well. Thank you all for being here. Questions?
Nancy, thank you for a huge presentation in a short period of time. It was really exemplary what you've been able to pass along to us. I want to ask you the first question about how you got to where you are today from being, initially from being a graduate student way back when. Some of our speakers have traced a little bit of their initial career, how they got into doing what they're doing from being a graduate student. I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about what sparked your interest in this huge area that you're in now. If you could talk a little bit from your initial stages of being a graduate student into the initial stages of your career as an academic.
Oh, bless your heart. Isn't it wonderful we get a chance to talk about how it all happened? And I would say it was a mix, you know, it's fire and ice. It's Robert Frost's poem. So I had this intense, I have no idea why, interest in the North. I had a deep understanding at a very early age that we have destroyed a lot of the environment and continue to do so. But I worked through my undergrad, I was very committed to environmental education. When I tried to intervene at a hearing about a little piece of important land, with a lot of significance ecologically and geologically, I got about 2 minutes, and the chairman said, "Thank you very much, next." And it was very clear that poetry was not the language to address policymakers. So at that point, I said, right, back to science. I was the kid with the chemistry set in their bedroom. Back to science and a command of the voice that is respected. So as an undergrad, I was privileged to take a course with Frank Banfield, who had been the head of the Museum of Nature. Frank Banfield was a consultant of the Canadian Arctic Gas Consortium, which was exploring one of 3 pipeline routes across Alaska, Canada, and south to carry Beaufort Sea gas. And he had a deep engagement with the embryonic field of environmental assessment. As a result of that, and at that point I was a joint major in biology and geology, so I applied to field camps, to companies doing field work. I had a list of 120 companies that I knew were actively involved in Arctic exploration and doing assessment work. I wrote to them and applied for summer jobs. I got 62 letters of rejection. The rest didn't bother to reply. Many years later, a friend told me, well, if you'd applied to be the cook's helper, it would have been no problem. So the gender bias, that's one of the places where the fire comes from, because when you've been up against the gender bias all your life and discounted as a result of it, you remember that. So that didn't work out so well, but I finished that degree, and then my undergraduate thesis was very successful. It was about fire ecology and reconstructing climate change. And my advisor wanted me to go on, and I had been so mangled by the administrative system in the academy. I just said, no, I'm not going on. There was no obvious place to go. He said I should go straight into a PhD. I said, I can't. So I headed for the woods, back to my roots in environmental education and working with kids. I thought, no, kids get it. There may be no hope for the academy. So I then spent time qualifying in order to get accepted into programs in the United States because there were no equivalent programs in Canada. I got a fellowship. I went to Montclair State College on a fellowship as an international fellow in environmental education, which was part of environmental studies for a master's. And then I encountered a drunk driver, and that introduced me to another layer of power and influence and a whole suite of things that happened. I came home and recovered, and then I looked at my options, and I applied to York to Osgoode Hall for environmental law. That program was a conventional law program plus a master's in environmental studies. I was accepted, I went, and at that point, actually even before I went to York, I got a small contract through the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, with whom I'd been associated for a long time as a student member. And that contract was to look at the implementation of the Niagara Escarpment Commission and to look at the problems with local community and landholders and landowners and the ratepayers groups that were really concerned about the imposition of a layer of essentially expropriation. And so the work they wanted me to do was to look at the potential application of conservation easements in Ontario. I did that study, made the case. Along the way, oh no, I can't go on forever on this. So along the way, I was working closely with the executive director of this coalition, which was largely based in Toronto. And the coalition had many influential people in its membership and in the leadership of its member organizations. We were able to carry the ball on the solution of introducing conservation easements and some other measures as far as the Deputy Premier of Ontario. And we had a meeting with him. He said, well, if everybody in the coalition is on board, we can do this now. And the executive director and I looked at each other, and we went back to our leadership. And someone said, I will not attribute the quote, but someone said, I will not get into bed with the ratepayers, and that was that. And at that point, I started law school. I'd already had my first doses of realpolitik. But that executive director listened to me. We drove around a lot. We went to a lot of meetings. We drove down gravel roads. He listened, and when I found out he had worked in the Arctic and he knew Thomas Berger, I couldn't believe my luck. So I'm sure I interviewed him for hours on end. And he pointed me in the direction of the Inuvialuit. And that was where that connection began. I'll stop there. That's too much.
Okay, so it strikes me that what you're saying is that you came across an incredible amount of adversity and you snaked your career around in order to address that so that you could move forward. And then you mentioned just most recently that you did have some luck. But what strikes me throughout your story is the persistence. And I'm wondering what you say to yourself when you feel like you're not making much progress. What is it that you say to yourself that keeps you moving forward?
But the progress is not mine. The progress belongs to us all. And this is a very deeply rooted philosophical strand, and I owe Carolyn Merchant a great deal for her sorting out of the roots of the philosophical problem. So Carolyn Merchant in the 80s wrote a book called The Death of Nature. And while I was at York doing the environmental studies component of my program, I took a course with John Livingston. It was a reading course, and John Livingston had also worked in the Arctic quite a bit and had written a number of books about the travesty of Arctic oil and the destruction that was occurring. Anyway, he put us on to Carolyn Merchant, and her account of the philosophical roots of the problems that we create through our belief systems and our economies, which are based on our belief systems. It's a really strong, compelling argument. And I do believe that we have got to solve all of these problems together in order to have a future for anything we care about. It's all on the table, and that's what keeps me going.
Okay.
Experience, which told me as a small child that something was dreadfully wrong in our world. I mean, eventually I understood that what had happened was midnight dumping from an oil refinery complex, 20 miles away. I date myself. And those dead birds were the victims. They were the victims of our letting things be the way they are. So you start with science and you think, okay, there's going to be a technological fix. We're going to figure out how to do things differently. But at the end of the day, you will have corporations dumping mercury in rivers as long as it's not an issue. And so making it an issue is an endless challenge under the sort of the system that we have. If we had a different value system that said, water is precious, water is life, it's not a place to put human waste or anything else. If we adopted a different strategy with respect to water, we would change the future very, very drastically. So there are things that we can learn from other people who live in different relationships to other environments that are not easily understood by us without another standpoint. So I come back to the work that Jeffrey's doing. I think it's incredibly important. It's part of articulating the need for inclusion, the need for diversity, and the need for respect for others so that we can begin to learn, that we can go out and share, and through that sharing, we can move towards sustainability.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question that's come in. Could you comment on the travesty of Western science and the caribou events that you mentioned earlier in your presentation? So I'll just read that again for everyone. Could you comment on the travesty of Western science and the caribou events that you mentioned earlier in your presentation?
Oh, this is a lovely story. And I told this story for about 3 years to my friends and colleagues and anyone who was interested. And then finally, one of my dear colleagues in the field of co-management. Fikret Burkus picked it up and eventually got someone to write it up. So the story is in real time. It's the early sort of mid-'80s, and there is money in the budget for the biologists who study caribou for the government to fly around and do censusing. And at that time they did aerial censusing with air photos. They would take photographs and then do counts, and then do some, essentially it's conversion of the counts to a density index. And then you can kind of, you know, with some parameters for margins of error, you can do estimates. So the biologists went out in the fall and started flying the herds, and this is Central Arctic. These are the big herds in the Keewatin. And so they started getting numbers. And the numbers, like this was a herd of, at the beginning of all of this, 500,000 animals. And so they got a radical, apparent drop in population numbers, something like 50% or less in their censusing. And then they stopped because it was the end of the fiscal year and they didn't have any more money for flying until the new budget came in. Meanwhile, their contacts with the hunters and trappers organizations told them that most unusually this year the herd had split. And for some unknown reason, a large segment of the herd had decided to migrate north instead of south with everybody else. But the biologists didn't believe them. And the biologists then sent out this hue and cry. The media picked it up. And the hunters were being accused of all kinds of atrocities, of decimating the wildlife, and calls for restrictions on their hunting. All of that was in the media. And then, when the weather got better, lo and behold, they got more money to fly, and the herd numbers jumped way, way, way up. And that was not natural increase. That was the truth of Inuit knowledge about what was going on. And so at the end, I was actually in the Legislative Assembly in Yellowknife. At that point, it was still the Northwest Territories before the creation of Nunavut. I was in the Legislative Assembly the day that the Assembly called on the chief biologist who had been responsible for all of this, and he made his statement and was soundly told off by the Assembly, and subsequently left for the Yukon. So that was really quite an astonishing set of events. But if you want a dramatic case, I know Fikret had someone write it up. I'm not sure where I'll have to find it again. But it does exist as an academic piece.
Thanks very much for that. Another question, we're very conscious about the importance of reconciliation, and we acknowledge land claims when we do presentations like this and so on. But how can we move forward on reconciliation, both within Canada and beyond? Have you got some tips for all of the people that are listening to your presentation this morning? What can we do as individuals and also as smaller groups to advance reconciliation, both within Canada and beyond?
Thank you, Marion. Thank you. There are many things, and there are some very interesting movements. So if I flash back to theory, in the 80s, there was a small community of North Atlantic scholars, South Scandinavians, a few North Americans, some Icelanders. We were interested in autonomy movements in the North Atlantic. And so we were looking for essentially a regional governance, ways of accommodating difference. The example of the Greenland Home Rule government was a very important one, created in the 1970, to establish a measure of autonomy for Greenland. And at that point, Greenland became autonomous except for mineral extraction and foreign policy. That was retained by the government of Denmark. So there are movements that happen at big scales in geopolitical terms that are very interesting and very important and should be celebrated. And from those beginnings, we've now achieved quite a transition in the North. Just as Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council made the move from treating Northern peoples as objects of research that was fundable, provided it was an academic person applying for the money, to moving forward to a partnership model in research. We also see the emergence of Inuit to Inuit research assemblies and funding for this. And we also see the emergence of Inuit to Inuit collaborative governance arrangements. Now, arguably, one can say these are informal, but the arguments that one makes through international law connected to customary international law. And again, understand that legal debate, the reason lawyers are in existence and the reason that they make money is because they're able to disagree with one another and persuade people that the disagreements are important. So of course there are disagreements about the interpretation of international customary law, and I have a very evolutionary view of this. And I wrote a bit about it in the Denver Law article on whaling. Anyway, so we can advance these movements towards reconciliation, which is essentially reconciling ourselves to facing the atrocities of the past. Our hands are not the ones that brought about the devastating treatment directly, but we're the beneficiaries of the inequalities that atrocious treatment has produced. So we do carry some residual, I feel, duty to deal with this. And then when we look at what's going on in other groups, and we look south of us, there's a very interesting movement that began in the United States that's really gathering quite a bit of steam. And it started with church groups and with the Haudenosaunee, who were the ones who signed the treaty with George Washington that led to the creation of the United States of America, and is the reason for the Americans putting the eagle on their national symbols. There's a lot of important symbolism there, and that's before Canada was created, okay? So if we go back and we listen to what the Haudenosaunee are saying, and we listen to what is being done through the University of Syracuse on the Doctrine of Discovery, it takes us into this interesting network across the United States and a bit beyond. Some of us in Canada are interested also. Church groups, community groups, trying to address the unreasonableness of the Doctrine of Discovery. This goes back to terra nullius, and it goes back to the idea of possessing territory by exploring it. So there's a movement afoot now in the United States to seek reparations, to give as a gift some honor to the obligations that we feel we carry. And there are church groups in the United States that have been trying to figure out how to give land back to Native assemblies who once controlled those lands, lived there, were the beneficiaries of those lands. And it's not really satisfying under American law at this point, but there are active instances and there are pathways that are being traced for this to happen.
Well, thank you for that, and we'll start to wrap up now. Thank you for an excellent presentation, and again, putting so much into a short period of time, Nancy. You're really very skilled at that, so thank you so much for doing that. And I want to thank participants for their compelling questions, and we hope that the information that's been provided is useful to you as you're moving forward in your careers. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening next in terms of the webinars. We're looking forward to hosting the 9th webinar, and it will be entitled Economic Development and Policy Relating to the Northern Context. And it'll feature Dr. Laura Way, who is the Manager of Strategy Policy at the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency. And then Laura's an academic who left and went into policy side of moving things forward, so she'll have a different career trajectory to reflect on. That'll be happening Tuesday, April the 6th from 10 to 11. And I know it's hard to believe April is here, but it is here, so 10 to 11, and that's Eastern Daylight Time. For those of you that are joining us from other time frames, you know that we're on Eastern Daylight Time now. So again, I want to thank Nancy. What a wonderful way you've led the webinar today. And enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. We look forward to your participation in our next exciting webinar. Thank you, merci, and you too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.